Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the second of our June lecture series. Today I'll be presenting a talk about biblical archaeology, by which I mean archaeology in the Holy Land, roughly in the period described by the Bible. So, for everyone who is online, thank you for tuning in. Please feel free to type in the YouTube chat if there's any problems with the broadcast or if you have any questions. And anyone who's here in person, feel free to chime in at any point if you have any questions or comments. Thank you. Okay, so before I go into biblical archaeology specifically, I'd like to tell you a story about archaeology in general. So, this is a man named Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann is known as one of the first archaeologists, amateur archaeologists, since archaeology was not a field back then. Archaeology developed after the era of Heinrich Schliemann into a scientific profession, which it is now. But Heinrich Schliemann was born in Germany in 1822 and came from a very poor family. So Heinrich Schliemann was born to a family of 9 children, which he was the middle child. His mother died at a very young age. His father was a Lutheran pastor, was very well read, and introduced Heinrich Schliemann to the works of Homer, such as the Iliad, the Odyssey. So Heinrich Schliemann grew up with these stories, being told stories of Troy, of Mount Olympus, of Odysseus, and he fell in love with these stories. So, after his impoverished upbringing, working hard labor for many years, in his 20s, Heinrich Schliemann began working for an import-export company. And by the age of 25, he was running this company because he was very, very good at business and very, very good at languages. So he learned Greek, he learned French, he learned Russian, he learned English. And by the age of 35, Heinrich Schliemann was rich enough to retire and living in Russia at the time. So, what does he decide to do in his retirement? He decides to find Troy because this has been his dream since he was a small child. And since he's extremely well read, he thinks he knows exactly where Troy is. He believes that Troy is in modern day Turkey, or Anatolia as it would have been known in Roman times. And he goes digging in Turkey. This is a site called Hisarlik in western Turkey. And at Hisarlik, Heinrich Schliemann strikes gold, both literally and figuratively. Starts digging, finds a buried city. But he knows that this can't be the real Troy. This must be a much more recent city. So he keeps digging, finds another city under that. But he thinks, still not old enough. This can't be the Troy that I'm looking for. Keeps digging, finds another buried city under that. And he keeps on digging and digging and digging and finds a total of 9 buried cities. And in archaeological parlance these days, we would call these Troy 1, Troy 2, Troy 3 in the order from bottom to top. So he keeps digging until he hits Troy 1, the oldest city at the bottom, where he finds a hoard of jewelry, which he gave to his wife to wear. He and his wife then proceed to smuggle the hoard out of Turkey, get sued by the Ottoman Empire for stealing antiquities, be forced to return these to the Ottoman Empire. And then Schliemann goes on to do the same thing at sites in Greece, such as Mycenae and Tiryns. Now, the catch to this story is he was looking for Homeric Troy. So Schliemann was looking for the Troy of the Iliad, the Troy described in Homer's epics. And he believed that this would be the oldest city, the oldest Troy. And he was very, very wrong. So, in the process of trying to find Homeric Troy, Heinrich Schliemann destroyed Homeric Troy. Homeric Troy was Troy 6 of the 9 buried cities which he dug through and destroyed. So Troy 1, which was all the way at the bottom, is believed to date now to approximately 3000 BC. So much, much, much older than could be possible for Homeric Troy. And this is a cautionary tale that all archaeologists learn nowadays about not presupposing what you'll find in the field, and also of how archaeology is a destructive process. So once you excavate a site, it's destroyed. Excavation is destruction. And if everything that isn't uncovered in that site isn't recorded, it's lost. It's gone forever. So this story of Heinrich Schliemann finding and destroying Troy is a cautionary tale for all future archaeologists. Now we're talking about biblical archaeology, so this is a little later. This is a man named William Albright, and he is widely considered to be the father of biblical archaeology. So Albright is an American. He started his career as a scholar of biblical texts coming from the field, the German school of biblical textual criticism. And later in his career, he turned his interests towards archaeology in Israel. And he was one of the first scholars involved in the authentication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And during his long career excavating in Israel, among other contributions, he developed a standard pottery typology for this region. Pottery is one of the main ways that we can date sites. And Albright and his colleagues from this first era of biblical archaeologists were driven by a desire to prove the Bible. So they wanted to prove that the events in the Bible had happened the way the Bible says they happened, and that the people it described in the Bible were real people in the way that the Bible describes them. So, as I will describe in later slides, this attitude in some ways can be problematic in the same way that Schliemann's desire to find the real Troy was problematic. So after Albright, partially contemporaneous with him, we have a man named Yigal Yadin. Yigal Yadin is one of the most important figures in biblical archaeology. He really founded the field of Israeli archaeology. So Yigal Yadin was born in Palestine during the last years of the Ottoman Empire. And as a teenager, he joined the Haganah, which is a Zionist paramilitary group, which would later become the Israeli Defense Force after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And Yadin was a very high-ranking officer in the Haganah. And after the establishment of the State of Israel, he became chief of staff in the IDF. But he resigned from his military career to pursue a career in archaeology. And during his career, Yigal Yadin was the first to excavate many of the most important sites in Israel. And these include Qumran and Masada, Tel Hazor, Tel Megiddo, and Tel Kabri, a couple of these that I've excavated at. So Yigal Yadin's motivation was to use archaeology to construct a national identity for the young state of Israel. And many of his publications support his nationalist, Zionist narrative of the history of his country. So this is especially evident in his excavations at Masada, for example. Yadin characterizes the Bar Kokhba revolt, which led to a big standoff at Masada with many Jewish freedom fighters, he would call them, holding out against the Romans, and eventually all committing suicide, all becoming martyrs on the site. So Yadin characterizes them as heroic Jewish martyrs, the last fighters for a Jewish state. And this thread of nationalism, really you can trace through all of Yadin's works, the sites that he chose to excavate and the narratives that he constructed from them. And some of the issues with Yadin's work are that since he's very early in the field of biblical archaeology, he didn't always use the best methods, which I've experienced personally having excavated through his backfill. So,
excavated what? Iris?
So I excavated at 2 sites in Israel, Tel Kabri, which is a Bronze Age site, and Tel Megiddo, which is, the portion I excavated was from the late Bronze Age, but there's a very, very long history at Tel Megiddo, and I will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So I'm going to just pull up this chart here so that I can show you exactly what kind of time periods we're talking about. So this is a chart, oh, I'm sorry, I have to end the presentation, I think, and then, yeah, I think I have to end the presentation and then pull up the chart from here. There we go. Okay, so archaeology in the Levant, which is the region of the Eastern Mediterranean. This region contains Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, southern Turkey a little bit. We use a special type of periodization to refer to specific periods of time where we see definitive changes in material culture. So you can see here it starts in the Stone Age. What we colloquially know as the Stone Age is divided into the Paleolithic and the Neolithic periods. Paleolithic being before agriculture and Neolithic being after agriculture. So the Neolithic Revolution is the term for when humans widely adopted agriculture and settled into fixed communities, which would sustain themselves with agriculture, rather than being predominantly hunter-gatherers who would move with their prey or wander around with the seasons as natural produce was available to them. Agriculture allowed them to settle into fixed communities. And in many ways, the Genesis story of Genesis 2 and the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden parallels the Neolithic Revolution. Kind of the way that humans went from living in harmony with nature, with the animals, to becoming distinctly human, living in settled communities, practicing agriculture and creating material culture. And the big revolution that we see when we started creating material culture is right here, around 5500 BC, when pottery was invented. So before then, it's called pre-pottery Neolithic, and then pottery was invented. This was probably the most important invention in the history of archaeology, because pottery is the way that we date most archaeological sites. I cannot stress enough how important pottery is, because by the style of pottery, by how it's decorated, how it's used, that's how we can narrow down, sometimes down to the decade, exactly when a site is dated to. And then we move on to the Chalcolithic Age, Copper Age, up to 3300 BC. So during these time periods, there are still no large settlements, no cities that we would know of. This changes roughly in the early Bronze Age, where the first city-states, like the first large civilizations, start to develop. And some of the oldest civilizations would be Mesopotamia, the Old Kingdom Egypt. So these are around the 3000 BC-ish era. Now, when we're talking about biblical archaeology, we go even farther. So past 3000 BC, past 2000 BC, and into late Bronze Age 2 here. This is where the line would be where the exodus out of Egypt is assumed to have taken place, but I will just spare you the suspense. There's no archaeological evidence for the exodus out of Egypt, but we wouldn't expect archaeological evidence for something like that, like for an event which happened suddenly and led to 40 years of wandering around the desert. That's not really something that we can dig up. And then starting in the Iron Age, around 1150 BC, this would be the traditional date for the Israelite conquest of Canaan. So, starting in the Iron Age, that's where we would put the start of biblical archaeology. And at this point, the Bible still hasn't been written yet. So, we can go farther into the past, this 1000 to 900-ish BC. These would be, we would guess, the dates of the reign of King David and Solomon, and the monarchic period of the Kingdom of Judah would be a bit further along, 900 to 700-ish, and then 700 to 586. 586 BC is the traditional date of the destruction of the first temple and the conquest of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar and the exile into Babylon. So after this, we have the Babylonian period, where the Judean elite is in exile in Babylon. Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. They are returned to Judea, and this is what's known as the Persian period. This also overlaps with what's known as the Second Temple period, when the Second Temple was built under the blessing of Cyrus the Great, who allowed the Judeans to rebuild their temple. And the next major period after this is the Hellenistic period, which begins with the conquest of Alexander the Great, who conquered the whole region and then promptly died, and his empire was split into smaller kingdoms ruled by his generals and their descendants. So the Judea was passed around the client kingdoms for a while, ending up in Ptolemaic hands for a while, Seleucid hands for a while, until the late Hellenistic period, where we see the Maccabean revolt, which is described in the books of Maccabees, where Judah Maccabee and Shimon Maccabee lead a revolt against the Seleucid Empire, drive them out of Judea, and establish a new Jewish monarchy, which is known as the Hasmonean monarchy. And this ends in 37 BC after a few decades of decline, because the Hasmoneans made a very big mistake and invited the Romans in to settle a dispute. So they were having a civil war over who would inherit the throne. One Hasmonean has the bright idea to invite the Romans in to settle this. The Romans, of course, never leave. Once you invite the Romans in, they never leave. So after a few decades of Roman influence, the Romans became the de facto rulers of the region. When Herod the Great a client king under the Romans, overthrew the Hasmonean dynasty, and this is the beginning of the rule of the Herod the Great that we see described in the Gospels in 37 BC. And then after this period, up to 70 AD, this is what I would consider the end of the period of interest for biblical archaeologists specifically. Because Herod the Great and his descendants under the Romans rule Judea until 70 AD, when the Romans finally destroy Jerusalem, destroy the Second Temple for good. It is never rebuilt after this. And then 70 AD, up to the fall of Rome, that's the later Roman period in Judea. And of course, we can go up to modern history with this, into the Byzantine period, the various Arab caliphates, the Crusader period, and to the Ottomans and the modern day. So I will go back to my presentation here. Oh, sorry. So something to note is that the state of Israel tightly controls all the antiquities and excavations which occur within its borders. But the state of Israel only considers sites and objects pre-1700 to be archaeological material. Anything after 1700 they don't really care about. Which, given like the long timelines that we're dealing with, seems reasonable, but it also serves to skew archaeological scholarship in the direction of older sites with a specific focus on this biblical period, which lasted roughly 1,000 years. So a lot of what we would consider Palestinian history of the people of the region post-Jewish diaspora, isn't considered archaeological by the state of Israel. So this isn't the type of stuff you would see in museums, for example. There's not a lot of scholarship on it. So the state of Israel still very much has an agenda in this regard, in focusing scholarship on a specific era and of discouraging scholarship, and in some ways like trying to erase interest in this era that's post-Jewish diaspora. So I'm going to go back along the timeline now, and we'll show you the start of biblical archaeology. And so these are a couple of pictures of the sites that I excavated at. So this is me excavating a corridor at Tel Kabri in northern Israel. And on the right side, we have Tel Megiddo, which I also excavated at, which is a much larger site. These are both Middle Bronze Age sites, or at least this section here, which is one I excavated at, the very deep hole, dates to the Middle Late Bronze Age. And Tel Kabri is entirely a Bronze Age site. There is limited habitation at the site after the Middle Bronze Age. So during the Middle Bronze Age, Canaan was characterized by large palatial settlements, such as we find at Kabri, and there's evidence of widespread trade within the region. For example, we find lots of Cypriot pottery at Cyprus, lots of Mycenaean pottery at Megiddo, and especially we see the influence of Egypt and fine wares from Egypt and rich finds such as gold, jewelry, showing that Egyptian cultural dominance in the region was prevalent for hundreds of years during the Bronze Age. Something we especially found a lot of was scarabs, like little stone carved scarabs with Middle Egyptian inscriptions in them. And these would typically hold like your name it would be your name written in Middle Egyptian. But in Canaan, they couldn't read Middle Egyptian. So sometimes they just have nonsense that looks like Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs. So at this point in Canaan, during the Middle Bronze Age, around 1400 BC, there is no known writing system yet. And both of these sites were originally excavated by Yigal-Yadin, who did not record his finds because he did not find them important enough. He used both sites as training digs for his students, and often we could not tell whether we were digging through his backfill or digging through a new area of the site until we would hit some kind of oddity like a bottle cap or something that would tell us this was originally excavated like in the 70s. So this is a huge problem for modern archaeologists when older archaeologists have been through a site, didn't record their finds, and now everything's out of context. So we can't tell what time period this piece of pottery that we dug up came from, because it could have been dug up somewhere else and then just backfilled into the site, like on the back of a dump truck. Well, this is a huge problem for archaeology in Israel. So around the 12th century BC, these large palatial economies that we see in Canaan, that we see in the Mediterranean, such as the Minoan site at Knossos, these abruptly end, and we see a prolonged decline in material culture over the next few hundred years. So scholars still don't know what caused this phenomenon, which we call the Bronze Age collapse. This occurred widely across the Levant, not exactly at the same time in every region, but some of the theories for what may have caused this are climate change, possibly natural disasters such as earthquakes or volcanoes, warfare. The warfare theory goes into the Sea Peoples theory, which I find particularly interesting because we still don't know who or what these Sea Peoples were. The Sea Peoples are mentioned in inscriptions from Egypt, from the reigns of Ramses II, Ramses III, around the 12th century BC, which describes conflicts with the Sea Peoples and their incursions into Egypt. And the Philistines, which are described in the Bible, are believed to be descendants of these Sea Peoples who were running rampant over the Levant and causing chaos. And this is an example of Philistine pottery from the Israel Museum, and it's notably different from Canaanite pottery at the time. But we still have no idea who these Sea Peoples were, or where they came from, or why they were causing so much trouble in the Levant at the time, and possibly caused the collapse of civilization. It's possible they might have been a coalition of different tribes who might have come from further west in the Mediterranean. They might have come from the Cycladic Islands, but really we have no idea, which I find really fascinating and really shows you the limits of archaeology. If there's a gap in the written historical record and in the archaeological record, then we literally know nothing. But their impact is still seen, like in later generations. So going forward a few hundred years, the conquest of Canaan, as described in the book of Joshua, we would guess took place roughly between 1300 and 1100-ish BC. But the archaeological record seems to maybe tell a different story. So this is a picture of the site of Jericho, which is one of the oldest inhabited sites in the world. So habitation at Jericho goes back to at least 3000 BC, long before the biblical period. And Jericho was excavated first by a very famous figure in the field of Near Eastern archaeology, Kathleen Kenyon. And what Kathleen Kenyon discovered was that in the years where we would assume that the biblical conquest of Canaan took place, there doesn't appear to be a major destruction layer. And a destruction layer is something that we refer to in biblical archaeology as like a layer of the excavation where there's notable burning, maybe unburied corpses, lots of rubble, evidence of fighting, such as weapons or arrowheads. And there is nothing like that in Jericho during this like wide time period where we would think that the conquest of Canaan might have taken place. And the famed walls of Jericho that came tumbling down when Joshua blew the horn. These also, we don't have evidence of their destruction during this time period. So the walls of Jericho that Kathleen Kenyon excavated are much older, like likely around 1400 BC. So this is pre-Bronze Age collapse. And these were destroyed like shortly after the 14th century, but they were likely destroyed by the Egyptians at this period, which were culturally dominant in the region. And all the evidence seems to suggest that the site was mostly unoccupied in the centuries after, like up till the 10th or 9th century BC. So here's a picture of Kathleen Kenyon at Jericho sorting through some pottery. And this is a stratified site in Israel, which is broken up into squares using what we call the Wheeler-Kenyon method. So this is still the method which is predominantly used in Near Eastern archaeology today. And it's to divide a site up into squares with a thick wall between each square, which is called a bulk, and to excavate down systematically in each square and to record each layer as you go. So leaving this bulk in between squares allows us to easily read stratigraphy. And by stratigraphy, we mean the process of being able to read the vertical layers of habitation as we go down. So this is a chart that would show you what ideal stratigraphy might look like at an archaeological site. So if you're digging down in this square and you have this vertical bulk in front of you, then once you've dug down far enough, you can ideally see all of the different layers of habitation, one on top of another, starting at the oldest, prehistoric or Stone Age, and then maybe there was a Roman fortification on top of that, and then maybe there was a medieval fortification on top of that, and anything modern will be on top of that. So this is what stratigraphy looks like in real life. So it's not quite as clear and easy to read. But I think you can still see that there's like very noticeable differences. Here we have a layer of red clay. Here there's some notable inclusion, which is probably pottery in this layer. And then here we have another noticeable difference in the soil color. So lower layers in stratigraphy represent older layers of habitation, older events. And a layer is no older than the most recently dated artifact that's found in it. That is, unless it's been previously excavated or robbed out, which is a very, very common problem in Israel. And in a stratified site like this, it's very easy to see the temporal relationship between objects which are found in context. So let's move a little bit farther along in the timeline to around 1000 BC. And this is the start of the early Iron Age. And this marks the first notable shift from Canaanite material culture to the more distinctive Israelite material culture. But the archaeological record across Israel doesn't demonstrate a quick shift in material culture that would be evident of a conquest, for example. Similarly to Jericho, there is no destruction layer roughly corresponding to what we would originally have assumed the date of the Canaanite conquest to be at any of the major sites of Israel. So this was first pointed out by a very famous scholar named Israel Finkelstein, who excavated at Tel Megiddo. I worked for him at Megiddo. He excavated Tel Hazor. And he suggested that rather than a sudden conquest and sudden destruction of Canaanite culture, the settlement of the Israelite people into Canaan was likely a more gradual process, and may have been more of a process of immigration and cultural assimilation rather than a destructive one. So we move a little bit farther in time to the 9th century BC. This is a very interesting object that was excavated at Tel Dan, which is the very, very northern tip of Israel. So this dates to the 9th century BC, which is well into the monarchic period. And this is the closest that we have to any proof of the existence of the House of David or King David. So this is a stele, which is a stone object with a written inscription on it in Aramean. And this inscription is an Aramean king celebrating victory over an unnamed king. And the highlighted portion here says, of the House of David. So if we compare this to the biblical account, then this appears to refer to the victory of Hazael of Damascus over the kings Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah. And inscriptions like this are often the best archaeological sources for proof that a certain event happened or that a certain person existed. Now moving a little bit farther in time, this is a site called the City of David, which is located in current occupied East Jerusalem, just outside the old city walls. So this is one of the first sites to be excavated in Israel, starting in the mid-19th century. And it represents like the full spectrum of biblical archaeology, all the way from the Bronze Age up to the Second Temple period and up to the present day. And today the City of David both has ongoing archaeological excavations and is open as a tourist attraction where you can see previously excavated sites and the Siloam Tunnel. So this is a very fun thing to do if you are ever in Jerusalem. The Siloam Tunnel is an ancient aquifer, like a waterway that was built in ancient times to carry water from the Gihon spring into the city of Jerusalem. So there is a biblical account of a waterway built during the reign of King Hezekiah around 800 BCE in Kings 20. But modern dating methods have suggested that this waterway might actually be a little bit older than that. Uranium thorium dating suggests that the rock, the carved rock that the tunnel was made out of, may date to around the 9th century BC. And this tunnel goes from the City of David out into East Jerusalem. It's about a mile long, and it's water about up to your waist if you want to walk it as part of the tourist attraction. And it comes out into the Siloam pool, which is referenced in the Gospels, but it's not the same pool that it's referenced as in the Gospels. That pool is actually a few kilometers to the west. So the pool that this Siloam tunnel comes out into is Byzantine era, and you can walk for a mile in complete darkness. I think some people get claustrophobic and they'll do it in groups, but I love to do it alone. Yeah, you have to bring your own flashlight. Do not go in without a flashlight. And when you come out on the other side, you will just dry off instantly because the Judean sun is very, very powerful.
That's made out of rock, right?
Yep, it's carved straight through the rock. Yeah, it's very, very impressive for an ancient era aquifer. So in another part of the city of David, there is this large stone structure that was discovered in 2005 by an archaeologist named Eilat Mazar. Eilat Mazar immediately declared that this structure was the Palace of David, and she dated it to around the 10th or 9th century BC, when we believe that King David must have lived. And Mazar had been digging at this site, trying to find King David's palace since 1997. And this particular excavation was privately funded by an American businessman. So here's a better view of the large stone structure from above without the scaffolding. So Eilat Mazar's theory created a lot of sensation in the media at the time, but it's since been challenged by numerous scholars, including Israel Finkelstein. And Finkelstein's theory was that this isn't one structure. This isn't even all from the same time period. Like, if you look at like a floor plan of this, it doesn't look like one structure. It looks like houses. And likely they don't date to the 9th century BC. They're Hasmonean era houses from the Hellenistic period, around the 3rd or 2nd century BC. Now this is up for debate because we can't date stone structures in the same way that we could date organic materials like wood or papyrus. So radiocarbon dating can give us a rough idea of where those come from. But you can't carbon date a rock. A rock is not made of carbon, so it doesn't contain any C14. So the only way to date structures like this is context. So that's where the unfortunate nature of the City of David excavations comes in, that this is not a stratified site. It was excavated haphazardly by many different people from the middle of the 19th century. So there's really no way of telling how old this large stone structure is, whether it's actually the Palace of David, whether it's Hasmonean era houses, as Israel Finkelstein suggested. Now, there have been some finds like within this vicinity that support Eilat Mazar's dating, which are fine goods dating to the 10th century BC, like ivory and fine pottery. But since these were potentially found out of context, we're not sure if they are connected to this large stone structure. And this is one of the biggest problems with the City of David excavations, unfortunately, along with the fact that the City of David is on Palestinian land. So the City of David is located in occupied East Jerusalem, and the Oslo Accords do allow for Israelis to excavate in Palestine and to occupy that land for the duration of the archaeological excavation. But the City of David excavation has been going on for over 100 years, and it's now been turned into a tourist site. And it also keeps expanding year after year So many Palestinians have been evicted from their homes for the purposes of archaeological excavation. They were never given a date for when they might be able to come home, for when the excavation might end. And it seems like the excavation will likely never end because Israel is profiting off of it, like enormously. This is one of the most popular tourist attractions in Jerusalem. So this is one of the dark sides of excavating in the Holy Land. The political motivations behind it, the very suspect funding from private American sources, and the real people that it affects who will never see the benefits from this archaeological excavation. So I'll move a little bit farther into time now and tell you about the end of the First Temple period. So Solomon's temple and the city of Jerusalem were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, in 587 BC. This is very well corroborated by Near Eastern sources, by Assyrian sources. This is one example. It's a tablet in cuneiform and describes the military campaigns of King Nebuchadnezzar. And cuneiform is the writing system that was used in Babylon at the time, which is interesting because it's not an alphabet. So I'm not sure how well you can see on the slide, but cuneiform is written by taking a reed pen and pressing it into wet clay to make these markings that look kind of like arrows, pointing in different directions. So this was the writing system in the Babylonian Empire at the time. And from a little bit earlier than that, like pre-destruction of the First Temple, we have the oldest ever discovered example of a biblical text. So this is one of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, which was discovered at a site in southern Jerusalem. It's a scroll made of silver, which dates to around 600 BC, before the destruction of Jerusalem. And this contains a portion of the priestly blessing, which we know from Numbers 6, which goes, the Lord bless you and keep you, the Lord make his face to shine upon you, the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So that's what a portion of this one scroll contains. And the other one contains fragments from a few known texts, for example, Exodus and Numbers, but not a complete text, such as the priestly blessing, which you would recognize. So going a bit further in history, my former colleague Katie gave an excellent presentation about the Dead Sea Scrolls last week, so I won't go too much into that. But the site of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, was inhabited from roughly the Hellenistic period, like 200 or 300 BC, up to the Roman conquest in 70 AD. And this probably the most important site in Israel, where the oldest complete biblical manuscripts were found, was unfortunately subject to similar uncontrolled and haphazard excavations, as we see in the city of David and many other sites, which were driven by political motivations and by profit. And similar to the city of David, Qumran has also become a tourist attraction, with a visitor center which is pushing a very odd narrative. So if you go to the tourist center at Qumran, they will show you a video which is pushing what I would call a conspiracy theory that John the Baptist was an Essene who lived at Qumran and later passed on the Essene way of life and the teachings at Qumran to Jesus when he met Jesus. So there is no evidence for this whatsoever, but I think that the reason that they want to push it at the visitor center at Qumran is just to drive interest in the site and maybe to appeal to other conspiratorially minded groups like certain fundamentalist Christians. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, similar to many artifacts discovered at sites in the West Bank, which were discovered by Israeli archaeologists, were seized by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and some of them by private entities such as the Catholic Church. And Palestinians have no access to these objects, which are as much part of their history as it is part of Israel's. So you come to the end of the first millennium BC. Let me recap on some of the ways archaeology can and cannot be used, or should or should not be used. So with methods such as the Wheeler-Kenyon method of stratigraphy, archaeology is very good at finding broad trends within a certain geographic area. For example, like you can look at vertical trends from a particular site by examining the stratigraphy, or you can look at horizontal trends over a wide geographic area by looking at sites in this area that are dated roughly to the same time period. And when we discover artifacts in situ, like where they were buried, archaeology is very good at telling us where these artifacts, or when these artifacts came from. As long as the context is preserved, we can learn a lot through excavation this way. And due to the types of things that we excavate, which tend to be larger structures, cities, things like that, archaeology is great at telling us about architecture and wide patterns of habitation and other things on a large scale. And to some degree, archaeology can corroborate written sources. Now, on the other hand, due to the nature of archaeology, it is not very good at finding specific people or specific objects. Unless you already know where these things or these people are buried, you probably won't find them. It's harder than finding a needle in a haystack. Just digging a hole at some place in the world and expecting to find some very specific object, it's probably not going to happen. And this type of assumption that you're going to find something at a particular place can lead to trouble, as we see in the story of Heinrich Schliemann. And archaeology can't tell us much about objects that aren't found in context. So things like radiocarbon dating can only be used on organic materials. If we find something like a fragment of pottery or a fragment of stone that's out of context, we have absolutely no way of telling where it came from or when it came from. So this is why it's so important that excavations be conducted in a controlled manner and that the context be recorded before things are moved. Because once that context is lost, it's gone forever. And anything that we could have learned about that object, that's also gone forever. And the types of objects that archaeology can uncover tend to be things that last a long time. So stones and pottery and monolithic structures, we find lots and lots of these. But highly perishable items like clothing, food, wooden structures, these are not likely to survive the ages, only under very specific circumstances. For example, at Pompeii, where you have this huge volcanic eruption that buried everything in volcanic tufa for millennia. That is a 1 in a million, a lightning strike chance, where it's perfectly preserved many things that we would never otherwise find, like food still on the tables, people's clothing, and people, like people huddled in corners, dogs. So it's also important to remember, like, given the limitations of archaeology, that archaeology can't prove a negative. Just because there's no archaeological evidence of something doesn't mean that it never happened or that it never existed. It just means that we haven't found it. And there are, as I've described, there are many, many reasons why we might not have found it. So I'll move on to the second portion of this presentation, which is the archaeology of the New Testament. And this is the time period around the 1st centuries BC and AD, the periods described in the Gospels. So this is just a picture of one of the views from the hills of Jerusalem. On the left is the tomb of Bnei Hazir, which is Hellenistic era, I would say, and the tomb of Zechariah, which would be 1st century AD. These types of monumental tombs, especially pyramid shaped, were very popular in the Hellenistic era for the wealthy elite of Jerusalem. So archaeology of the New Testament is complicated by the fact that with the New Testament, you're very much looking for very, very specific people and places. And as I said, archaeology isn't great at finding those. So any finds we do have tend to be down to random luck. And this was a great random lucky find. This is an object which is called the Pilot Stone, which was discovered completely by chance in the city of Caesarea Maritima. This is a Roman era city which was built by Herod the Great in the 1st century AD. And this was found wedged in an unrelated 4th century building, so much later Roman building, where it was a reused building block, which originally came from a 1st century building. And the inscription in Latin reads, it's fragmented, but if we fill in the blanks, we think it read, Dis Augustus Tiberiarium Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Judaeae, fecit dedicavit. So, roughly translated, it says Pontius Pilate, Praefectus Judea, dedicated this to the deified Tiberius. So we think that this originally came from a temple to the deified emperor Tiberius. And not only does it mention the name Pontius Pilate as Praefect of Judea, but it corroborates the gospel account, which names Pontius Pilate as the Praefect of Judea, compared to other ancient Roman sources. For example, Josephus and Tacitus both name him as procurator, which is a different rank. But this inscription names his rank as Praefect, which is what is written in the Gospels. So, instances where we're able to find proof of a single person's existence or a single person living at this particular time tend to be down to random luck. And the exception to this is of people who left a huge impact on the archaeological record by altering the landscape of their day, by literally leaving a dent in the landscape. And the number one example of this from biblical times would be Herod the Great. So Herod the Great was a prolific builder. He completely transformed the landscape of Jerusalem and the sites around Jerusalem. He built numerous monumental palaces, fortresses, cities. He built Masada, he built Caesarea Maritima, and he built Herod's temple. So this is a model of Herod's temple from the Holy Land Museum in Jerusalem. And Herod undertook an enormous renovation of the Second Temple, which was built during the Persian period, around the 6th century BC. So in the 1st century BC, Herod started a colossal reconstruction of the Second Temple to really leave his mark in history. And the temple during this period was the center of Jewish life in Jerusalem. So it wasn't until later centuries after the destruction of the temple that Jewish communities had synagogues or other places that you could worship, or the idea that you could worship God at home. When you went to worship God, you went to the temple if you were in Jerusalem. So this was the center of Jewish life, and it was unavoidable if you were Jewish in Jerusalem. So Josephus describes the layout of the temple as comprised of a number of walls and courtyards. So the very outer precinct of the temple, the outer retaining wall, was covered with signs saying, "Do not enter if you're not Jewish." And then on the inside, Jewish men and women were allowed into the courtyard. And there was an inner courtyard where only Jewish men were allowed. And then this temple building itself, only Jewish priests were allowed. And in the middle of this, in the very, very inner sanctum, was called the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest was allowed on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. And this Holy of Holies in the first temple, in Solomon's temple, we believe to have housed the Ark of the Covenant. But the Ark of the Covenant, if it was ever in the temple, is lost. Even by the Second Temple period, it was likely already lost. We have no record of it in the archaeological record, and it's likely it would not have survived to this day, being made of wood. So this is an interesting find which was discovered just outside the Temple Mount during the Ottoman era. This is a stele that originally was hung on the outer perimeter, on the outer wall of Herod's temple. And it's in Greek, and the account in Josephus states that these warnings were written in Greek and Latin all around the outer walls of the temple. And a rough translation says, "No stranger is to enter within the balustrade round the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be himself responsible for his ensuing death." So this is one of the warnings that was posted around the outside of the temple so that no non-Jewish person would enter. So all that's left of Herod's temple after its destruction by the Romans in 70 AD is the Western Wall. This wall still stands in Jerusalem, and this is the western portion of that outer retaining wall, the balustrade wall. And this isn't all of it. Quite a bit of it is underground. That would have been ground level, habitation level back in the Roman periods. But you can see really the impressive monumental architecture with these huge stones, which were quarried from local limestone from the area. There's stones that are several meters wide, like many thousands of pounds, and they get larger as you go farther down. So there is one wall still standing, and there is tons and tons of rubble. Like absolutely enormous piles of rubble from the Roman destruction, which are still there to this day, lying all around the Temple Mount. Now this is a picture of the Arch of Titus in Rome, which commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem. And here are the Romans carting off all of the looted goods from the Temple of Jerusalem. You can see the shofars, the trumpets there, there's a menorah, and interestingly, this is the earliest artistic depiction we have of a menorah. Menorahs are described in the Bible, but not very well. This rounded design was adopted from the Arch of Titus as being the base design for menorahs for all time. The biblical description only states that it has 7 branches, which could mean anything. It could have been shaped like a tree. So this depiction was highly influential in Jewish art of the time period and moving forward. So here is another picture of some more of the rubble from the Second Temple. Now, while it would be great if we could excavate on the Temple Mount, I'm sure we would find tons and tons of stuff. It is impossible due to religious sensitivities. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven, is currently on the site of the Second Temple on the Temple Mount. And Jews are forbidden from entering the Temple Mount, not because of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but because of fear that they might step into the site where the Holy of Holies once was, because we have no idea where it was, and like contravene one of the greatest taboos of their religion accidentally. So for that reason, no religious Jew is permitted onto the Temple Mount. And excavations also cannot be conducted on the Temple Mount. So there have been some excavations around the perimeter of the Temple Mount, near the walls of Jerusalem. And there's an ongoing sifting project to sift through the rubble.
What exactly are we looking at in this image, Iris?
So this is an excavation site, which is just outside the Temple Mount area in Jerusalem. You can see on the sides the walls of Jerusalem, the current Old City walls, which date to the Ottoman era.
Okay, the walls of Jerusalem, not the walls of the temple, the wall of the temple that remains.
No, there is only one remaining wall of the temple, which is this one, the Western Wall.
And that's the Wailing Wall.
Yeah, also known as the Wailing Wall. And all along the rest of the city of Jerusalem, around the area of the Temple Mount, there's just these piles and piles of rubble. So there have been some small finds from the sifting project, but because it's, again, not a stratified site, we're not always sure what date these small finds come from. So to anyone hoping to find the Ark of the Covenant under the Temple Mount, it's just not going to happen. We can't excavate there, and even if we could, it's likely that things like that would not have survived to this time period. So this is one of the finds from the excavations near the Western Wall, which is a mikveh. Many of these have been found near the vicinity of where the temple used to be, which demonstrates the fixation with ritual purity from that era. Jews used to visit the mikveh, where they would dunk themselves ritually in the ceremonial waters to purify themselves before visiting the temple. And we found these all over Israel, but the concentration would be like by far the highest and within the vicinity of the temple. This is another common find within the city of Jerusalem, not just around the temple, but there are tons and tons of these limestone vessels of all shapes and sizes, of drinking ware, plates, dinnerware. These are extremely characteristic of the era of the late Second Temple period, from the late 1st century BC up to 70 AD. And we're not exactly sure why there's so many of them. This is a very strange thing to have be a widespread phenomenon. Like, I don't think it'd be very convenient to drink out of a solid limestone cup or eat off solid limestone plates. But there are thousands and thousands of these, and especially at rock quarries where these were produced, we just find piles and piles of them. So this is a very odd phenomenon of stone vessels being very popular in Jerusalem during this period, and only in Jerusalem. My theory is that they were a byproduct of Herod the Great's quarrying around Jerusalem. So Herod opened many quarries around Jerusalem to quarry the stone needed for his building projects. But much of the stone quarried wouldn't have been of the quality or the size needed to be used in the building projects. So I think this was kind of a way of using the byproducts from his monumental building products. But that is just my theory. There is not a whole lot of scholarship on these stone vessels, even though we find tons and tons of them. And there's no written records about them, because they probably just weren't important enough to be written about. Like, if you're going to write down a historical account, what shape your dinnerware was probably wouldn't be in it. So around the same time period, maybe a little bit earlier, we also see the phenomenon of stone ossuaries becoming common in Judea. So unlike the stone dinnerware, this isn't just a Jerusalem phenomenon. These are more common in Jerusalem, but these are found all over Israel. So during the Hellenistic period, there's a very notable shift in burial practices from the Iron Age, where they would practice communal burial in charnel pits, to individual burial in these stone ossuaries. So the practice during the Iron Age would typically be to bury the body, not in a coffin, just like very minimally, maybe with a cloth, leave it to rot for a year or two, and then dig it back up, put it in a tomb with the ancestors. Literally with the ancestors, as that tomb would be a pile of bones with your fathers and forefathers, and they would all just be mixed up. So when it says in the Bible, and he slept with his fathers, they mean that quite literally. So there's a shift during the Hellenistic period, starting around the 3rd century BC, where we first see these stone ossuaries. So there's no longer communal burial, but individual burial, or sometimes burial with a couple of close relatives in one ossuary. And these ossuaries would be stored in rock-cut tombs, just like this one. This is the Talpiot tomb in Jerusalem. And they're made of many materials. We found clay ossuaries, ceramic, but mostly limestone, especially in the Jerusalem area, mostly limestone. And some were decorated, probably depending on the wealth of the family member, and some were very plain. So these little niches you can see in the back of the tomb, these are called loculi, and each of these niches would have held one body or one ossuary. And these types of rock-cut tombs are extremely common in Jerusalem, and these would have been the type of tomb in use at the time of Jesus. So when we think of the biblical account of the resurrection of Jesus, the burial and resurrection of Jesus, we often think of a single cave, maybe a stone slab in it where the body was laid, and a rolling rock which covered the entrance. But it's more likely that he would have been buried in one of these types of stone-cut tombs with loculi, which may explain why some of the Gospels, Matthew 27 and John 19, we feel the need to specify that Jesus was buried in a newly hewn tomb where no one had yet been buried. Because typically, when one of these had been in use for a while, there'd be other bodies in there, or stone ossuaries containing the bones, which had previously been bodies. So this is a very beautifully decorated ossuary, which was discovered in Jerusalem. And this one bears an interesting inscription, which says, Yosef ben Caiapha, so Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And since it does date to around the right time period, the 1st century AD, it's possible that this ossuary contains the remains of the high priest Caiaphas, who is described in the Gospels. Of course, there's no way of telling exactly. It could be someone from the same family. In fact, there were the bones of several individuals found in this ossuary. But it is from approximately the right time period. So it is possible that this is the final resting place of the high priest Caiaphas, who condemned Jesus. Now, we've also had some sensationalist claims about these stone ossuaries. Some of you may remember in the early 2000s, there were a few ossuaries discovered by amateur archaeologists who claimed that these contained the remnants of Jesus and his family. There was a special aired on the Discovery Channel called The Lost Tomb of Jesus, where the amateur archaeologist in question claimed that because of the inscriptions found on these, he believed that they were the burial place of Jesus, Jesus' brother Joseph, Jesus' mother Mary, and his wife Mary Magdalene. But scholars were very quick to debunk these claims because they were based on no evidence whatsoever, even though they made it all the way to mass media in the United States. In the end, this was not really an excavation, but I guess there were some claims of looting of antiquities by these amateur archaeologists who then interpreted the inscriptions on these in a way which suited their sensationalist story. It's not very visible on the slides, but here there's an inscription which reads Yehuda ben Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus, which is where the sensationalist claims started. Other ossuaries discovered in the same tomb had the names Mariam or Mariamne and Joseph. But the number one issue with these was that these were extremely common names at the time. So about 25% of the female population of Jerusalem at the time was named some variation of Mariam. And not all of the tombs from this, not all of the burials from this tomb are from the same generation. Not all of them date to the 1st century AD. So just to claim that this collection of names in this random tomb in Jerusalem must be the lost tomb of Jesus is a completely absurd claim. But this happens frequently in the field of biblical archaeology. Completely random finds will be sensationalized. It'll make it onto mass media. Some people will believe them, but there's no scholarly evidence for it whatsoever. And this is an ankle bone, which was found in another stone ossuary from the 1st century AD, which is very interesting because it's the only archaeological evidence we have of the phenomenon of crucifixion, which is very odd, you would think, because it's so well documented, not just in the Bible, but in contemporary sources and many Roman sources, that the Romans crucified people. But when you think about it, it's also not the kind of thing that would tend to survive in the archaeological record. Most of the people who were crucified would have been given paupers' burials, maybe mass burials in unknown locations. And things like wooden crosses, these wouldn't tend to survive the eras. So the fact that we have one crucified ankle bone, an ankle bone with an iron nail through it, it does kind of make sense that this would be all that would survive, like all the physical remains that would survive.
So in
Of
this
the
image,
practice.
it's the ankle bone that's the relic is on the right.
So this was the ankle bone that was discovered in ossuary in Jerusalem, and this is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like whole.
Yeah.
So this ossuary had an inscription on it that read, Yonatan ben ha something. It's mostly illegible. But it appears to be some kind of maybe a Jewish malcontent who was crucified for in some way upsetting the ruling Romans. There was another one of these that was very recently discovered in Italy, I believe. Recently, as in like last year. And that's all we have in terms of physical evidence that the Romans crucified people. So that again illustrates some of the limitations of biblical archaeology. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is the site of Holy Sepulchre. So this is the inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has for centuries been venerated as the burial place of Jesus. And Holy Sepulchre is an enormous church. So the current church, it's also believed to contain the hill of the crucifixion, Golgotha, the stone of anointing, the slab where Jesus' body was anointed by the three Marys, and the site of the prison of Jesus. So on the left you can see the stone of anointing, which is right at the entrance of the church as you go in. And on this side is the Catholic altar at the site of Golgotha, which is just upstairs from there. And the stones here are believed to be the original stones from the site of Golgotha, also known as Calvary. And this is a picture of the outside of the Church of Holy Sepulchre. So it doesn't look so big from the outside, but quite a lot of it's underground because it's a very old building. So what kind of evidence do we have archaeologically that this is the correct site for the tomb of Jesus? And the answer is not a lot, because like many sites of religious significance, the church cannot be excavated. So there is good archaeological evidence from the building next door, which is the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, who's conducted excavations on their land, that the area around Holy Sepulchre was a rock quarry during the 1st century AD, and that it was outside of the old city walls during the time, as the Gospels describe. So, however, there's nothing from within Holy Sepulchre itself, except the fact that it's built over a 1st century tomb. So, by random chance, about a month ago, like a month or two ago, there was a very interesting find from Holy Sepulchre as they were undergoing renovations. They dug deep enough that they hit a 1st century layer, and then some archaeologists were very fortunate to get some soil samples from those renovations. And analysis of the soil samples showed that they were the type of soil that would have been in a garden, very rich soil used for cultivation and not a rock quarry. So that would also seem to support the biblical account of Jesus' tomb being in a garden. But I think most importantly, this site has been venerated since the 2nd century AD as the site of the tomb of Jesus. And for places like this, which cannot be excavated, often historical consensus is the best evidence we have for the historicity of an account. So the fact that there's almost complete consensus, going back so far, back to at least the 2nd century AD, is very good evidence that this is the correct site. Now, there is a competing site in Jerusalem called the Garden Tomb, and this was first proposed in the mid-19th century by a number of different Protestant groups as being the burial site of Jesus, likely because they were not happy with Holy Sepulchre. So Holy Sepulchre is a very religiously intense experience. As you walk in, there's incense everywhere. There's monks and priests from at least 6 different denominations. Every denomination has carved out like their own niche in the church, and they have an altar, and they are often not happy with each other. They are constantly fighting, and for that reason, the fact that they could even conduct renovations on Holy Sepulchre is a miracle. So, several Protestant groups have latched on to this alternative site, the Garden Tomb, which is on the north side of Jerusalem, currently outside the modern Old City walls, as being an alternative site. But if we have little archaeological evidence for Holy Sepulchre being the correct site of the tomb of Jesus, we have negative evidence for the Garden Tomb. So for, like in the first place, the Garden Tomb is not likely a 1st century tomb. Modern archaeologists have investigated it and looked at the layout and seen that it's not the type of rock-cut tomb with loculi and ossuaries that we would expect of the 1st century. It's more characteristic of an Iron Age tomb where communal burial was practiced. So this is likely a 9th or 8th century Iron Age tomb. The groove outside the entrance where the proponents of the Garden Tomb say that the rolling stone must have been, has also been identified to be more likely a Crusader era water trough for horses. And the same for the ancient cistern and the wine press, which were discovered in the area, which proponents of the Garden Tomb say was evidence that the area was a garden in the 1st century. These are also likely from the Crusader era, like 11th century or later. So why the popularity of the Garden Tomb, despite the total lack of archaeological evidence, and some of the evidence suggesting that it's not even like remotely from the same time period? Many of the original proponents of the Garden Tomb did not feel that they had a place at Holy Sepulchre. Like, it was not a place where they could worship. So based solely on this like feeling that they needed a place of their own, and based on the desire to have a Protestant place to venerate as the tomb of Jesus, I think that's where this Garden Tomb movement came from. And some of these proponents were originally Anglicans, the reason why St. George's was built so close to this location. And today the site is also a tourist attraction with a very nice modern garden and a very nice gift shop. And the owners are very careful not to say that it's the actual burial place of Jesus, but rather that it's a site for groups to come and worship and to picture the tomb as it might have been in the 1st century AD, even though it's not a 1st century tomb. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I just have a few like final remarks. So as we've seen, there's many problems with this notion of biblical archaeology. Archaeology can rarely prove or disprove a historical account. Finds are always open to interpretation. So doing archaeology with an aim to prove the Bible is problematic for this reason, and it's not really a good use of archaeology. Like presupposing what results you'll find in an excavation, like scholars who would excavate based on what they thought they knew of the Bible or what they thought they knew of Homer, like Heinrich Schliemann, these tend to yield poor results. Archaeology is better used to another end, which is to learn how previous generations lived. And I think that this is the most interesting use of archaeology, the most valuable use of archaeology, because it tells us a side of history that we won't learn from the written accounts. Archaeology is very closely related to the field of social history. So it can tell us how previous generations lived, what their houses were like, what daily objects they used. And I think this is infinitely more valuable than trying to prove a very specific historical event or historical person that we already have written accounts for. And finally, archaeology can be misused, and this is especially true in the Holy Land. In Israel and Palestine and regions with lots of ethnic and religious conflict, archaeology is very susceptible to misuse and to pushing particular political or historical narratives to support one side's agenda. So if you are interested in biblical archaeology, here are some book suggestions. These are all very, very brief and like good introductions to the field of biblical archaeology in general. So the first one is part of the Oxford or Cambridge. I think it's the Oxford series, a very short introduction. It's more like a pamphlet, it's like this thick. So that's where I would suggest that you start if you're interested in this field. And I'm not sure if they're available in the library, but these are all available on Amazon and on ebook services as well. So thank you for sitting through my very long talk on biblical archaeology. Please, if you have any other questions or comments.
Iris, when you started out by the guy trying to find Troy,
Mm-hmm.
now Ephesus in Turkey, when I was there, they said the present Ephesus is Ephesus 6, and all the others are underground. But that's a different site in Turkey.
Yes, that is a different site. Yeah, this is often how we date cities that have many layers of habitation. So the most modern city will be the last number. For example, with Troy, it was Troy 9. That was the one closest to the surface. And Troy 1 was the farthest down. And unfortunately, Troy's 2 through 9 were destroyed by Heinrich Schliemann.
Iris, the tomb of Abraham, is that where the second temple is built on top of? Is that where?
No, that's a different site. That's in, Hebron. Yeah, that's also a site that cannot be excavated.
Oh, that's what I asked.
Are there any questions online?
Nothing online.
Okay, so I think we can wrap up the live stream then.
Bye, everyone.
And Hebron is in the occupied territory?
Hebron is a difficult situation because it's a divided city.